The rich, earthy scent of truffle risotto filled the air at Le Magnifique, an upscale dining spot where the elite dined under glittering chandeliers. The evening buzzed with conversation and clinking glasses. Just another night, until the quiet murmur of shock began to spread. "Baron Trump just walked in," a waiter whispered, his face pale as he darted toward the kitchen. The young son of the former president entered with his security detail, the scene straight out of a Hollywood drama. In the kitchen, Chef Olivier, celebrated for his culinary brilliance, looked up from his station, his brow furrowing. "Not tonight," he muttered. His sous chef, Brian, froze mid-step. "What do you mean, chef?" Brian asked, eyes wide. "I mean, I'm not serving him," Olivier said, his tone steady but unyielding. The kitchen fell into stunned silence. "Why not?" asked Anna, the pastry chef, breaking the tension. Olivier's jaw clenched. "I have my reasons," he said curtly. Meanwhile, Baron took his seat, his guards scanning the room with hawk-like intensity. In the kitchen, the air grew heavy with unease as staff members pleaded with Olivier to reconsider. In the dining area, guests whispered, craning their necks as the minutes ticked by. "He's refusing to serve Baron Trump," one guest exclaimed, fork frozen mid-air. "Who does that?" The murmurs grew louder as the restaurant's maître d', James, nervously approached Olivier. "Chef, you can't do this," James said, his voice trembling. "They're asking for their order." Olivier didn't flinch. "Tell them we're not serving him tonight," he said, wiping his hands on a dishcloth. Baron, composed but visibly puzzled, glanced at his phone as one of his guards leaned in to speak. The dining room grew eerily quiet as guests noticed the unfolding drama. In the kitchen, chaos erupted. "You're destroying us," Brian hissed, his voice a mix of fear and anger. "This could ruin your career." Olivier's face remained resolute. "It's not about my career," he said quietly, his voice carrying an emotion that left his staff speechless. Outside the kitchen, Baron's security approached James. "Why has service stopped for Mr. Trump?" one of them asked, their tone measured but firm. James hesitated, his face slick with sweat. "I'll check with the chef," he stammered, retreating quickly. The tension was suffocating and no one could predict how far this would go or why it had started at all. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Olivier leaned against the counter, his hands trembling. The room was silent. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible. "Do you remember the protest 3 years ago?" Anna frowned. "Outside the capital. What does that have to do with this?" Olivier's voice cracked. "I was there," he admitted. "I lost my younger brother that day. Wrong place, wrong time. He got caught in the chaos." The room grew still. "And it's all over social media now," Brian murmured, tilting his phone so Olivier could see the flood of notifications. Olivier's face remained calm, but his voice carried a trace of doubt. "Let them say whatever they want." Meanwhile, in the dining area, Baron's chief security officer leaned in toward James, his tone growing firmer. "Our patience is running out." The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Baron's next move. At last, Baron rose from his chair, his imposing figure casting a shadow across the table. "I'll handle this myself," he said, his voice steady and resolute. He made his way toward the kitchen, his 2 guards close behind. Olivier's heart sank as Baron entered the kitchen. The faint hum of appliances filled the silence as everyone watched the scene unfold. "Chef," Baron began, his voice calm but commanding, "I hear you won't serve me. Can you tell me why?" Olivier hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His colleagues stood frozen, their eyes locked on the confrontation. Finally, he spoke, his voice trembling. "It's not about you personally. You've done nothing wrong. I can't." Baron's brow furrowed in confusion. "I don't understand. If I've upset you, I apologize." Olivier's fists clenched at his sides, his emotions threatening to spill over. "It's not about you," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "It's about what your family stands for to me. A loss I can't forgive, a wound I can't heal." For the first time, Baron's expression softened. "I'm truly sorry for your loss," he said quietly, "but carrying that pain forever won't bring anyone back. I came here to eat, not to create conflict." Olivier's breath hitched, the words hitting him harder than he expected. Yet, the pain within him felt insurmountable. Could he ever move past it? The atmosphere in the restaurant grew heavier with every passing second. Guests whispered in hushed tones, trying to piece together the tension in the room. Why would he refuse to serve Baron Trump? One woman asked her husband. Even the staff huddled together, their expressions a mix of fear and disbelief. The elegance the restaurant prided itself on had crumbled into chaos. Nearby, sharply dressed Secret Service agents exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to proceed. Baron sat quietly in his seat, his hands resting on the table, a flicker of sadness in his eyes. "Is it personal?" a guest muttered loud enough for others to hear. The whispers escalated, suspicion and frustration spreading through the room. Some began to accuse the chef of letting his temper cloud his judgment, but no one could understand why Baron had been singled out. As the tension reached its peak, the maître d' approached Baron with a nervous expression. "Mr. Trump, we deeply regret the inconvenience. Perhaps we can—" But before he could finish, Olivier burst out of the kitchen, his voice cutting through the room. "Don't offer him anything. Not from my kitchen." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Baron, whose calm, piercing gaze met Olivier's defiant stare. The boy remained silent, yet his quiet demeanor spoke louder than words. "Why?" demanded one of the Secret Service agents. "Why won't you serve him?" The chef, his name tag reading Chef Anthony, tightened his apron strings with deliberate force. "I don't owe you any explanation," he replied curtly, his tone sharp and unyielding. Anthony's expression was stern, almost bitter. As one of Baron's guards took a step forward, the young Trump raised a hand, stopping him. "It's all right," Baron said calmly, his voice low but steady. "We'll leave." "No, we won't," interrupted a distinguished guest, rising from his seat. "Chef Anthony, this goes beyond unprofessional. It's outright cruel." Around the room, heads nodded in agreement, murmurs of disapproval growing louder. Anthony's voice cracked slightly as he snapped back. "I said what I said. You don't understand my reasons." Baron stood, adjusting his blazer with the quiet composure of someone much older than 17. Before walking away, he turned to the chef. "Whatever it is you're dealing with, I hope you find peace," he said, his tone resolute. Without another word, he exited, leaving the room in a stunned silence. As soon as Baron departed, whispers rippled through the restaurant. "A poor boy," an elderly woman said, dabbing at her teary eyes with a handkerchief. "He didn't deserve that." Others nodded in agreement, though a few tried to justify Anthony's behavior. "Maybe he has his reasons," one man suggested, but the sentiment failed to convince anyone. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Anthony leaned heavily against the counter, his hands trembling. His sous chef, Emily, approached cautiously. "Chef, what happened back there?" she asked gently. Anthony didn't respond. His face was pale, his eyes clouded by something far more profound than anger. Finally, in a barely audible voice, he muttered, "You wouldn't understand." Outside the restaurant, Baron climbed into a sleek black SUV as reporters swarmed the scene, snapping photos and shouting questions. Baron ignored them, staring out the window in silence. "Would you like to release a statement?" one of his guards asked. "No," Baron replied calmly, though his eyes glimmered with emotions he kept tightly restrained. "There's no need." That night, Anthony sat alone in his modest apartment, the city lights casting faint shadows through his window. On the table before him lay an old photograph, its edges worn and faded. It showed a young boy laughing with joy as he held a soccer ball. Anthony traced the image with trembling fingers, tears welling in his eyes. "Why now?" he whispered hoarsely. Why did he have to show up here? A sudden knock on his door startled him. Opening it, he found Emily standing there holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "I thought you might need someone to talk to," she said softly, her gaze kind. Anthony hesitated before opening the door, letting Emily step inside. They sat quietly, the weight of unspoken words heavy in the air. Finally, Emily broke the silence with the question on everyone's mind. "Why did you refuse to serve Baron Trump?" Anthony's fists tightened, his face hardening. "Because seeing him reminded me of everything I've lost," he said. Emily's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" she pressed. Anthony's voice wavered as he answered, "He reminded me of my son." By the next morning, the story had spread like wildfire. Major networks splashed dramatic headlines, ranging from Chef Anthony Sparks' outrage to Baron Trump's grace under pressure. Anthony woke to find his phone flooded with missed calls and messages, some from friends, others from strangers hurling insults. He ignored them all. At the restaurant, Emily tried to control the fallout. Reservations were cancelled, and the atmosphere among the staff was tense. Everyone wanted answers, but Anthony stayed silent. In his hotel room, Baron scrolled through the endless media coverage. Although online supporters rallied around him, his expression was somber. One of his guards spoke, but Baron barely noticed, his mind elsewhere. Back at the restaurant, Emily finally confronted Anthony. "You can't keep this bottled up," she said firmly. "If you don't tell your side of the story, people will think the worst." Anthony let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders sagging under the weight of years of grief. "Fine," he muttered. "But it's not a story. It's a tragedy." He began with trembling hands, staring at a worn photograph of his son. "His name was Ethan," Anthony said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "He loved soccer, pasta nights, and his laugh could light up a room." Emily listened, her heart sinking with every word. "I wasn't there for him when he needed me most," Anthony admitted, his eyes glistening with tears. "I was too busy chasing my career, too focused on dreams to notice my own son slipping away." Emily's voice was kind, but steady. "What happened to him?" Anthony took a shaky breath. "Ethan was in an accident. He was riding his bike to meet me at the restaurant. I had promised him dinner after work, but I was running late. Again, he didn't make it." Tears streamed down Anthony's face as he gripped the photo. "For years, I blamed myself. When I saw Baron sitting there, it was like seeing Ethan again, the same age, the same quiet strength. It brought it all back." Emily gently rested a hand on his shoulder. "But Baron isn't Ethan, Anthony. He's just a boy, and he didn't deserve what happened." While Anthony wrestled with his guilt, Baron sat in his hotel room, scrolling through more headlines. He stopped at one. "Baron Trump snubbed A lesson in grace, he sighed. Why do people blow things out of proportion? He murmured. A knock at the door interrupted him. James, one of his guards, entered. Baron, you should know. People are sending flowers and letters to the restaurant. Most of them are supporting the chef. Baron raised an eyebrow. Support? For him? James nodded. They think he must have had a personal reason. They're trying to understand him. Baron straightened, his expression thoughtful. Maybe I should try to understand him too. James hesitated. Do you want me to arrange something? Baron shook his head. No, I'll write him a letter. Something simple. That night, Baron carefully wrote a heartfelt note. He kept it short, but sincere. Dear Chef Anthony, I don't know your story, but I could tell you were hurting. I hope one day you can find peace. The Baron Trump. You remind me that everyone has their burdens to bear. Take care, Baron. Anthony folded the letter, tucking it into an envelope with care. The next morning, Emily walked into the diner holding a small package. Anthony, this came for you, she said, placing the envelope on his desk. Anthony, worn out from a restless night, furrowed his brow. What is it? He muttered. Just open it, Emily insisted, her voice tinged with curiosity. Reluctantly, Anthony tore open the envelope. As he read the letter from Baron, his hands began to shake. The words hit him like a mix of comfort and pain, both soothing and piercing. He read it a second time, slower now, then carefully folded it back up. Are you okay? Emily asked, concern evident in her tone. Anthony nodded, though tears welled in his eyes. He didn't have to do this, he murmured, voice barely audible. He should hate me. But instead, Emily gave him a gentle smile. Sometimes forgiveness has more power than anger, she said softly. Anthony's voice cracked as he replied, He's just a kid, Emily. And I let my grief make him a scapegoat. For the first time in years, the heavy burden of guilt started to ease. Anthony knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. Later that day, with the restaurant half empty and the staff tense, Anthony took a deep breath and stepped into the dining area. May I have everyone's attention, please? He called out. Conversation ceased and all eyes turned to him. His hands trembled, but his voice was steady. I need to address what happened yesterday with Baron Trump. A ripple of murmurs swept through the room as Anthony continued, his voice tinged with regret. What I did was wrong. There's no excuse for my actions. A few gasps punctuated the silence, but Anthony pressed on. I let my pain cloud my judgment. Baron didn't deserve my anger. He showed nothing but grace, and I responded with cruelty. The room grew still. Staff exchanged glances, and a few customers nodded in quiet understanding. Anthony lowered his head. I can't change what I did, but I promise to do better. I'm truly sorry. For a moment there was only silence. Then a smattering of applause filled the space. Emily, standing nearby, gave him an encouraging nod. As Anthony retreated to the kitchen, a long-forgotten feeling began to stir within him. Hope. 2 days later, as Anthony prepared ingredients in the kitchen, Emily rushed in, breathless. Anthony, you're not going to believe this. He looked up, puzzled. What is it? Baron Trump is here, she said, grinning, and he wants to talk to you. Anthony froze, his heart racing. What? No, I can't. Before he could finish, Baron walked into the kitchen, flanked by his security. Calm and polite, the young man approached Anthony. Anthony's hands trembled as he extended one to shake Baron's. You didn't have to come here, he stammered. Baron shrugged slightly. I wanted to. I read your apology. It takes a lot of courage to admit when you're wrong. Anthony's eyes filled with tears. I'm so sorry for the way I treated you. You remind me of my son and I—" Baron gently interrupted. "I understand. We all carry something. I just wanted you to know. I forgive you." At those words, Anthony broke down, years of guilt pouring out in a flood of emotion. Baron gave Anthony a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Take care of yourself, chef." As Baron left the restaurant, the staff stood frozen, their gazes following him with a mix of admiration and disbelief. News of Baron's visit swept through the city like wildfire. Headlines on TV and social media blared, "Baron Trump forgives Chef Anthony in heartwarming reunion." Overwhelmed by the media frenzy, Anthony chose to stay behind the scenes, quietly working in the kitchen and dodging interviews. But the impact of Baron's gesture went far beyond headlines. His act of forgiveness struck a chord with people everywhere, reminding them it wasn't about fame, it was about compassion. Support poured into the restaurant in the form of flowers, cards, and messages. Some were addressed to Baron, others to Anthony. Among them, a handwritten note caught Anthony's eye. It read, "Forgiveness can heal even the deepest wounds. Thank you for showing us it's never too late to change." Anthony held the note tightly, tears welling up in his eyes. For Anthony, it felt as if Ethan's spirit was reaching out through these strangers, yet he knew his journey wasn't complete. He needed to do something meaningful, not just for himself, but to honor his son's memory. That night, sitting alone in his apartment, Anthony made a decision that would redefine his life and his restaurant. The following morning, he called his staff together. The air was heavy with anticipation as they waited for him to speak. "I've made up my mind," Anthony said, his voice firm but emotional. "This restaurant has always been about exclusivity and luxury. That's going to change." Confused glances were exchanged. Emily finally asked, "What are you saying?" Anthony took a deep breath. "From now on, this will be a place where everyone, no matter their background, feels welcome. I want to host community dinners for families in need, for kids who rarely get a chance to celebrate. We're going to make this a space of connection and giving." Silence filled the room until Emily started clapping, soon joined by the rest of the staff. "That's an incredible idea," Emily said, tears streaming down her face. Anthony smiled. "It's what Ethan would have wanted. This is my way of making things right." Word of Anthony's plans spread quickly. Upon hearing about it, Baron sent a heartfelt letter. "Chef Anthony, your decision is truly inspiring. Ethan would be proud. If there's anything I can do to support you, please let me know. Baron." Anthony framed the letter and hung it in the restaurant as a beacon of hope and transformation. When the night of the first community dinner arrived, the restaurant was unrecognizable. The private booths were replaced with long communal tables, and the atmosphere buzzed with warmth and excitement. Families and children from local shelters walked in, their faces lighting up with amazement. Anthony greeted each guest at the door, nervous but eager. Emily handed him an apron, teasing, "Let's see if you still remember how to cook for a crowd." The kitchen came alive with laughter and focus as Anthony prepared hearty, simple meals. The comforting aroma of fresh bread and simmering sauces filled the air. When Anthony handed a plate to a small boy, the child looked up and said, "Thank you, chef." His soft voice reminded Anthony of Ethan, but for the first time, the memory didn't sting. It felt like a warm embrace. The night ended with applause from the guests. Standing before them, Anthony's voice shook with emotion as he said, "Thank you for allowing me to do something that truly matters. This is just the beginning." And indeed it was. Months later, Anthony received an unexpected phone call. "Baron Trump would like to attend your next community dinner," the voice on the other end said. On the big night, Baron entered the restaurant flanked by his security team. But this time, there was no tension, only joy and anticipation. Anthony greeted him warmly, a smile lighting up his face. "Baron, thank you for coming. It truly means a lot." Baron smiled warmly. "I wanted to see how everything turned out," he said, "and I thought maybe I could lend a hand tonight if that's all right." Anthony blinked in surprise. "Help? In the kitchen?" Baron nodded with a grin. "Why not?" That evening, Baron rolled up his sleeves and joined Anthony in the kitchen. They worked side by side, preparing meals while swapping stories and sharing moments of genuine laughter. The staff watched quietly, moved by the unexpected connection growing between the two men. When the meal was served, Baron didn't stay in the background. He sat among the guests, talking to the kids, treating everyone with warmth and respect. By the end of the evening, the room felt alive with joy and togetherness. Anthony knew in his heart that Ethan's spirit was present. As time passed, Anthony's restaurant became a beacon of hope in the city. People came from near and far, not because it was exclusive, but because it had heart. Anthony decided to rename the restaurant Ethan's Table in honor of his son. Every week the restaurant hosted community dinners, and the walls were lined with photos of smiling faces. Baron became a regular visitor, always bringing donations, fresh ideas, or even helping prepare meals. Over time, he and Anthony grew close, their bond strengthened by shared purpose and mutual respect. One evening, after a lively community dinner, Anthony and Baron sat outside under the night sky. The stars shimmered above as Anthony spoke softly. "You've changed my life, Baron." Baron smiled humbly. "No, Chef, you changed mine. You showed me that even in the midst of pain, kindness still has a place." As the years went by, Ethan's Table grew into something much more than a restaurant. It became a symbol of forgiveness, love, and new beginnings. Anthony finally found peace, and Baron became a living example of humility and compassion. Somewhere above, Ethan was surely smiling. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know what kindness, forgiveness, and second chances mean to you. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that uplift and inspire. Together, we can spread love and hope to the world.